It's a great honor to welcome Arash Azizi to this podcast. He is the senior lecturer in history and political science at Clemson University. And in this hour, we are focusing on his latest book, What Iranians Want: Women, Life, and Freedom. Arash, welcome to the show. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
Okay. So we are sitting here in the wake of the new wave of attack from the Iranian nation on the state of Israel. So I think it would be worthy to spend a few minutes discussing that.
For sure. It's a terrible condition in the region now. There is a threat of war, the dark clouds of war, a possibility of a conflagration that we've been worried about since at least October 7th. And, the past few years, really, but particularly in the last 6 months, is now closer than it's ever been. And yeah, it's a really worrying situation. Now, I don't know whether how much, if you want to go into detail or to talk about what happened or yeah, you let me know.
Okay. Well, just looking to get some of your views on the matter. I know that it's as of this recording is still currently developing, but I wonder if there's this flurry of opinions that says that because the presidential administration of Obama and I suppose Biden is because they are pursuing this conciliatory policy towards Iran, then it emboldens the regime to do these things. So I wonder
No,
what you
I don't. Yeah, no, I don't agree with that. I think these are sort of, this is very much, this is very much, it's not, I don't think it's actually a sincerely held opinion of a lot. I mean, I'm sure it's a sincerely held opinion of some people, but a lot of it is sort of DC, partisan bickering. And, look, Donald Trump was in power for 4 years. It's true that his much more aggressive tone against the regime did threaten the regime. It's also true that it emboldened the hardliners in Iran and really gave much more power to them, in my opinion. It's also true that it was Trump's leaving of the nuclear deal in 2018 that allowed Iran to get much closer to a nuclear bomb. To effectively, the Iranian nuclear bomb was gone. The JCPOA had effectively buried it. Of course, we don't know what would have happened had the JCPOA, the Iran deal, had continued. But what we do know is that enrichment was really low. Iran had effectively dismantled much of its nuclear infrastructure. But it was under Trump that it continued. It was also, let us remember, it was during Donald Trump's administration that Iran shot an American drone, and Trump didn't do anything about it. It was during Trump's administration that Iran engineered massive attacks on Saudi oil fields in 2019. Trump didn't do anything about it. So this whole thing about, conciliation versus the aggression, I mean, it's easy to say, right? The reality is the how to deal with the Islamic Republic will always be a bundle of a variety of facts. After all, let's not forget, Trump's position was that he just wanted to renegotiate a deal with Iran, and he went out of his way to say he would negotiate without preconditions. And he also said that the same leaders should and can remain in charge of the Islamic Republic, something that he was part of the reason why he got into a fight with John Bolton, his national security advisor, and fired him. So no, I don't think this is a basic, I don't think this narrative of Democrats being conciliatory and disemboldening the regime, has much truth to it, to be honest. Now, if you're to understand this moment, the reality is, yes, Islamic Republic is a threat to the region. It's a threat to regional peace, is a threat to the world, and it's always been. And frankly, so long as Ayatollah Khamenei is in charge, it will always be, because this is the type of politics that he represents. And as for the latest conflagration, though, I mean, the Israel's attack on the Iranian consulate in April 1st um, was a provocation, and was an irresponsible provocation. And now there's a debate as to, I am not sure myself whether it was an operational hubris, basically, thinking they can get away with hitting a consulate, or it was actually Netanyahu wanting to get into a war with Iran finally, because he considers that the right thing to do. I think it might have been a mix of this or either of this. At any rate, it was an irresponsible action. Iran's answer was also irresponsible. The key point here is that the people of Iran do not want a war with the people of Israel. The people of Israel do not want a war with the people of Iran. It's not a conflict that would benefit anybody in the region, and I hope everything can be done to avert it.
Now, your previous book is titled The Shadow Commander, and it's about the life of one General Qasem Soleimani, who, under the Trump administration, was killed. So I think briefly tell us about who he was and to what extent is his passing change U.S.-Iranian relations.
Qasem Soleimani was the head of the Quds Force or Jerusalem Force, really, which is the name of the external operations wing of this militia in Iran, the IRGC, Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps. Now, this is a very long way of saying his day job was managing this array of militias that are aligned with Iran in the region, sometimes called the Axis of Resistance. That is Lebanon's Hezbollah, the variety of Iraqi Shia militias. And Soleimani held this job for um, many years, since the late 1990s to the end of his life in 2020. And before that, he served in the IRGC in the war, with Iraq in the 1980s. And in between, he was busy on the eastern borders of Iran, fighting sort of drug dealers and drug operations out of Afghanistan and Pakistan. So he was a military man, and he dedicated much of his career into supporting of this militia, most of whom are terrorist groups in the region. And he represented really the emboldening of Iran's strategy of using these militias to advance his interests in a variety of Arab countries. In the 2010s, we had a period of sectarianization in the Middle East where Shia and Sunni, two branches of Islam, loyalties around them became somewhat central. I always thought that is a short-sighted framework if you just look at sectarianism, but at any rate, Soleimani had a big role in that period. So what he represents, if you will, is this axis that has really led, a group of anti-Israel militias is another way of looking at it, that has really led Iranian foreign policy. Effectively, the Iran foreign ministry has no role in picking ambassadors in the region. The embassy in Damascus that was hit, this is not an embassy that is run by the foreign ministry. It's an embassy that is run effectively by the Quds Force and the IRGC. So Soleimani's ghost, if you will, is very much around us as we see the battles today. And of course, it was Iranian hardliner media and state media themselves, when they were celebrating the October 7 attacks, they often did so in the name of Soleimani. And they remind of the fact that it is also true that he was a military, a very capable man, militarily speaking, with with long years of military experience, including in a classical war with Iraq in the 1980s. So he really upgraded these militias from being a sort of ragtag groups of ideologically enthused people with guns to serious military forces backed by a serious power nation state like Iran. So, that's his legacy, and we can see it around us today as well.
We are speaking now in the year 2024, so it has been 45 years since the revolution. Tell me about how the circumstances that led to that began.
Iran experienced a period of economic growth in the 1970s, actually. But, many people make the mistake of thinking revolutions occur when there is so much poverty, or there is a lot of downturn. Actually, revolutions often occur when, things improve, and then, a new set of conditions are created, and then something doesn't go so well, or something triggers the revolution. So if I want to give you, of course, the question of how and why the 1979 revolution happened is a very big question. Iranian social scientists, and you can say the entirety of Iranian studies has been trying to figure that out for the past, 4 decades or so. But my short answer to you, inspired mostly by Ervan Abrahamian, a leading historian of Iran, who's one of my sort of doctoral advisors as well, is that what best explains that revolution is that the Shah, that's the monarch who ruled Iran before 1979, the kind of economic modernization and that he had brought to Iran, moving Iran from a more feudal country to a more capitalist country, creating a larger Iranian middle class, which was the byproduct of that economic miracle, if you will, of the 70s, that Iran had almost double-digit economic growth for many years and really moved to become a middle-income country from a poor country. That this led to new expectations of this middle class who wanted more representation, and of course Shah's authoritarian system gave no representation to anyone, and that showed itself in a conflict between this working classes and middle classes who wanted more say, versus the Shah who wanted to limit them. And at the same time, this was an era of rebellious youth. Of course, it was the sort of era of the global 60s. It was the era of many oppositional sort of political activity around the world. But at the end of the day, it's also a very contingent question. This what I have been saying so far explains how the scene was set, if you will, and how why there are so many people who wanted the Shah gone, and why and how they took actions to make that happen. But the very fact that it happened the way it did, kind of miraculously as to how quick it was, when you really think about it. I mean, if when I do research, when I look at, let's say, September 1978, I mean, very few people really believed that the Shah was going to be gone in a few months. Famously, as you know, Jimmy Carter was in Iran in the new year of 78, and he called Iran an island of stability. And a year later, the Shah was gone. So I think that there's a lot of contingency to that, by which I basically mean that particular decision making is done by the and this is, we get in here, there are some conspiracies that I hate because they're not real history, that a lot of Iranian right-wingers particularly have conspiracies about how Carter brought down the Shah. No, Carter didn't bring down the Shah, but he also was not very enthusiastic about the Shah, let's say, and that had a role certainly in him feeling weaker and ultimately him leaving Iran. So the contingent part of it is that the Shah really, and if you want to look at it from a pro-Shah angle, is that he didn't, he didn't resort to killing tons of people, which is what Bashar Assad or other dictators do to remain in power. So these are the circumstances that led to the fall of the Shah in 1979, and the fact that the protest movement, revolution movement against the Shah, had been led by Grand Ayatollah Khomeini, meant that we were going to get this very strange creature, to quote Ahmad Sadri, the platypus of humanity's constitutional development, which is the Islamic Republic of Iran. It's sort of a crisscross between Margaret Atwood's Handmaid's Tale and Plato's Republic. It's a very strange sort of system that it's very much a result of its era. And it comes to be, it comes to be through that era and under the charismatic and ideological leadership of Khomeini, and unfortunately has remained with us to this day.
Mhm. No, it is I think it can be largely true that the current regime of Iran can be described as Islamic. Well, after all, it's in the name. But I remember last year I was talking to one of my classmates who was Iranian, and she was telling me all about this, all of the moral guidelines, as well as all of the, I guess, uh, of the requirements for religious adherence that the Ayatollah, first Khomeini and then Khamenei, applied. And it suddenly dawned on me that this is what Plato said in the Republic. The Ayatollah is basically the equivalent of the philosopher king.
That's not an accident. That's not
Oh,
an accident.
oh, well.
Khomeini was very interested in the Plato's Republic, and it's interesting that you sort of noticed that. But yeah, it's Khomeini. I mean, and people have written about this, but Khomeini was very interested in Plato's Republic, and it really is true that the Islamic Republic is more modeled on Plato's Republic. In fact, yes, it's Islamic in the name, and obviously the imposition of what they consider to be Islamic law is a big part of the story, and we can talk about it. But it's also very non-Islamic in a way that it's not how governance has worked in Muslim lands throughout history. I mean, In some ways, you can say this is the most anti-Islamic government because, after the death of Prophet Muhammad in 630s, there is a decision made in Islam effectively that the top religious leader, that at the top, the person who is in charge of political, the polity is not the prophet, right? It's not the continuation of, he's not the person who holds religious authority in the same way that the prophet did, right? He's the commander of the faithful. But I mean, I don't want to get into the details of Islamic governance for you, but basically, the idea that the top religious figure should also be the top governor, that the czar and the god's representative, if you will, have to be the same. It's not really Islamic in many ways. It contradicts Islamic history.
Mhm. Yes. So from my scant knowledge of Islamic theology, I understand that the two main denominations are Shia and Sunni, and Iran currently stands as the only Shia-based Islamic regime. So I wonder to what extent are the tensions between the Shia regime and the surrounding Arab Sunni regimes continue to persist?
I don't think, to be honest, I think sectarianism is a very limited lens to look at the Middle East. In some years, it was very important, let's say in 2010s. And that's because, not so much because of sectarianism, but sectarianization. Now, I hate to be sort of, you know, playing with all these wonky terms. But what I really mean here is basically that it's not so much so that Shia and Sunni are just naturally leading to fights, but it's that forces that really wanted to accentuate this contradiction between Shia and Sunni, if you will. They really, got it going in 2010s with some success. But the reality is that Islamic Republic's leadership is not really sectarian in some ways, because it's not sectarian because Khomeini and now his successor Ayatollah Khamenei, the supreme leader, have much bigger ambitions. I mean, what's the fun in being the leader of a minority Muslim camp? Because that's where it ends you, right? If you want to be a sectarian leader, okay, they would be leader of Shia Muslims. That's like 20% of the world's Muslims. Um, that's a very limited. Whereas they're really no, they're like universalist, internationalist revolutionaries. They wanted to change the world. So they always had much higher ambitions than sectarianism would give them. So I don't think you can understand the tensions between Iran and its Sunni Arab neighbors are not primarily understood, in my opinion, in terms of Shia versus Sunni. They're better understood in terms of a revolutionary regime who is a revisionist power who wants to change the dynamics of the region, who also wants to change the pro-Western orientation effectively all countries of the region, with the exception of a few, and those that are interested in that status quo. So it's much easier to understand Iran's posture in terms of revolution, in terms of anti-Zionism, opposition to Israel, in terms of anti-Westernism, than it is to understand it as, let's say, a Shia sectarian regime. I think Shia sectarianism was a useful, opportunistic, and occasional dynamic for it to use, and it certainly used it in 2010s, and it will certainly use it again. It certainly rests a good bit of its power on it, but I don't think it's necessarily wedded to it. And of course, Palestine is the best example here, right? If Shia sectarianism was the only thing that mattered to the regime, or even if it was its primary sort of concern, why would it support Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, which are not only Sunni forces, by the way? People don't know this. There are very serious Sunni Islamist forces. So Shias are actually forbidden to join Palestinian Islamic Jihad, according to its head, Ziad Nakhala. And I believe Hamas would probably have a similar policy. I mean, it's a moot question because there are very, very few Palestinian Shia anyways. So it's a moot question. But at any rate, they're Sunni Islamist in traditions of Muslim Brotherhood, which is not known to be very pro-Shia, basically. And this caused Hamas to break with Iran during the Syrian civil war, where sectarianism was on the high. Yeah, so I don't think the Islamic Republic is primarily understandable as a Shia sectarian regime.
Mhm. Now, I think we should segue to the tragic death of one Masa Amini now. Um, so you mentioned Margaret Atwood's novel, The Handmaid's Tale. For me, I think in that regime, the status of women is much more diminished than, say, the one in Plato's Republic. Because from what I can remember, in the Republic, women is advocated to have the same basic education as male and men, and also to, I think, serve the same positions of leadership as men. So through the eyes of the current regime, what are the roles of women?
This is a very good question. I mean, as a um, as a revolutionary regime interested in changing the world, right? Revolutionary regimes want something more than just power for themselves or a basic change in policy. What they want is to remodel the world. And it's part of this remodeling the world, I guess, in an ideal Islamic society is something that they've been trying hard from the beginning to find out, what exactly it means. But it's always been clear. I think The Handmaid's Tale, it gives liberal tones, classic Western liberal tones to use that as an example, as the kids would say. But I think it's actually very accurate in many ways. I think Margaret Atwood was partially inspired by Iran actually to write it. I'm pretty sure she said that actually. But at any rate, part of this ideal Islamic world is one in which women are, in a very classical, as Putin's Russia would want, as traditional conservatives in the US, many of them want women who are better as homemakers, who are, who also definitely, act in a certain way, and are good Muslims. And not only homemakers, right? There are different visions of this Islamism. Some of them are, there's a fact that IRGC had a very major female commander in its early years. It's an interesting sort of part of history. But this is actually a tension because at the end of the day, they do believe the ideal woman is a mother. So they have this natal tendency, if you will. But at any rate, definitely an ideal Muslim woman is one who commands, who follows Islamic rule. And one of the Islamic rule is that you cover yourself up. It's an Islamic rule that you women have to cover all of their body except for the face and the hand above the wrist. So Iran, in order to reshape society, imposed this as a state law that all women. It imposed this very early on. It met a avalanche of response. Thousands of women came out to protest against it. Even before the Islamic Republic was founded on March 8, 1979, which was on the occasion of International Women's Day, thousands of women came out to protest, as I explained in the first chapter of my book. And as much better than my book is Negar Mottaheda's Whisper Tape, which is about Kate Millett's trip to Iran. Kate Millett being an American feminist who came to Iran for the occasion of this day, and Professor Mottaheda has done a really great job of explaining that day and putting it in the context of Iranian history, Iranian sort of feminism. At any rate, so trying to impose this order on women became a very important element of the regime, and it's a draconian undertaking. When you really think about it, it's actually bone chilling. How can you enforce half of the society to dress a particular way? And this is exactly what the Islamic Republic set out to do. It remains the only state in the world that does that, with the addition of Taliban's Afghanistan, which is sort of an unrecognized regime that rules over Afghanistan. Um, and and so they do that from the early on, and they impose the compulsory hijab. They're able to crush their opponents, and they use this as a useful tool of pacifying society as a whole, of controlling society as a whole, right? Because when you are able to tell half of society what to wear and impose this on them, this is obviously a very useful tool of repression. So this becomes a really key element of the regime, and that's why it also never compromises on it. It's very interesting. If you look at the movement that my book is about, the Woman Life Freedom Movement, that of course breaks out when Mahsa Amini, as you mentioned, is brutally killed in a police station after she had been arrested because she wasn't covering her hair well. Um, um, she's killed, and people come out and protest. Now, if you're the regime and you sort of have a bit of a rational approach to things, you might just let this one go. And say, okay, we opened the hijab. I mean, it would have gotten. I think had they done that, it was likely that protests would have perhaps stopped at least for a while, But they don't do that, and not only they don't do that. What happened as a result of the movement was that after they were able to suppress the movement, they killed tons of people, they put people back home. There has continued a um, civil disobedience that in which millions of Iranian women just refuse to cover their hair, and there's a bit of a cat and mouse game with them and the regime. And in the last few days, in fact, on the very day when Iran attacked Israel, a few hours before that, it started a new round of enforcing the veil and of enforcing the hijab on the Iranian people. And you know, so this is very interesting. Like they made that decision, and that as Iran was entering this threat of war, that they would also try to. And really, in the past few days, it has been terrible. I mean, there are reports of tons of people, women being beaten up, being thrown into vans, being they really want sort of a rain down new wave of repression on the Iranian people. And it's central to who they are. The Islamic Republic knows that if it gives an inch on these key issues, it will lose. And it's very interesting because if you ask me what are these key issues, like what is really defines the Islamic Republic that are uncompromisable core of it, one of it is hijab. The other is actually this sort of enmity to Israel, and to the lesser degree United States. So these two things are very related. So it's interesting that April 13th can be remembered by historians as days in which these two elements really came together on one day.
Now, this is phrased in Arabic, Sharia, which is often like repeated by people in the West as Sharia law, which I find to be rather, eye-rolling because I think Sharia means law. So to what
Yeah, it's
extent?
funny that you say that. I usually tell my students that Sharia law is like chai tea.
Yes, that too.
It's the sort of a redundant term. Yeah.
But yeah, so to what extent is the current enforcement of women's headwear in Iran justifiable by Sharia the way it is I guess traditionally understood?
Well, I'm not an expert in Islamic law per se, but of course, I can tell you this: no other country, no other Muslim country in the world, with the exception of the illegal regime of Taliban in Afghanistan, enforces hijab. So, hijab historically has existed in Muslim societies, of course, for a long time. It has had its ups and downs in the 1950s and 60s, as various internet memes will tell you. Um, you know, it's not just about Iran; it's also in Afghanistan, in tons of other places. There was a lot of there was much less observance of hijab and other sort of Islamic rules, and later on there was more. But for the government, for the state to want to force it on everybody, it's very novel, obviously. And in general, of course, for religious law to be imposed on everybody in modern times by the government is rare, and it would be draconian to live under either biblical law or Sharia law in this in its this kind of orientation. And we say Sharia law here. I mean, I did say it was chai tea, but the separation here is between modern law, if you will, law that is enacted by a judiciary, as opposed to a modern judiciary. Right? And judiciaries are modern institutions, after all, everywhere, right? They come, a process in which you have lawyers who go study law, they get a degree in law, and you have judiciary. This in Iran, for example, it started only in the 1930s. Before that, of course, there was an entirely different relationship between statehood and governance, and clerical bodies that had judicial functions, and state bodies that had judicial functions. So for people to have to live under religious law is also quite rare. It's now much more common in many Islamic countries, in many Muslim countries, in a more limited way. Not as much as Iran, but it's usually a terrible. It doesn't take a lot to know that it's terrible news for women's rights in most ways. And before 1979, Iran had one of the most progressive family laws and women's rights laws in the region, and which was even quite progressive, frankly, by global standards. And this had been passed by the Shah's parliament, but it was advocated by a very strong feminist movement that existed in Iran at the time. People like Mahnaz Afghani, who was a minister of women's issues, something like that. He was sort of minister of state for women's issues in the last cabinet before the revolution, and a leading feminist intellectual who has remained one, who just published her memoirs a couple of years ago. He's a very respected academic today in the world. They had brought about this important um, achievements. Iran had female judges. Shirin Ebadi, who later on, of course, won the Nobel Peace Prize, was one. But the Islamic Revolution in 1979, Islamic Republic got rid of all of this and put women back for decades, really.
To what extent is the revolution of 1979 a sort of like, I guess, male anti-feminist backlash against the progression of women in that country?
It's a I wouldn't necessarily define the revolution itself in that way, because revolution and the way it led to the Islamic Republic was not a straightforward affair. Although there is something to this, right? There is something to this. It is a fact that in the general anti-regime outlook of the revolutionaries, and this interestingly, this includes not just Islamists, but even Marxists, let's say, Marxist socialists at the time, I think they had an image of, oh, the emancipated bourgeois women of the cities in Iran were seen as sort of being corrupt in some way, basically, and scenes of Westernism. But there was this terrible moment, if you will, in which what is obviously a reactionary, anti-woman, misogynist tradition of Islamism found a peculiar comrade in arms with socialist anti-Westernism, right? Which the socialist anti-Westernism made sense in terms of its global politics, right? But why would it make sense, for example, for someone to be both a Marxist and decry, let's say, women wearing makeup, or but I mean, it does make sense when you think about it in terms of the politics of the era, right? There was even a brand of feminism that frowned upon, let's say, wearing makeup um, or anything that was moving away from those traditional rules on Iranian women. So it's not that hard to understand how this became a component. But of course, most socialists who did that did not mean women should lose rights, or didn't agree with what Islamic Republic in effect ended up doing, but they were handmaidens to it. I bring an example of this in my book. For example, Homan Natef was a Marxist university professor who effectively opposed the anti-compulsory hijab protests and the March 8, 1979 demonstration. And she did so in sort of pragmatic way. For her, the priority simply wasn't women's rights or who wore what, but anti-imperialism, and you just thought, oh, we have bigger things to worry about than what women are forced to wear. She regretted that herself in later years and came to say that I really understood that. I think the phrase she uses is, people who tell you what to wear will tell you what to think, and she understood how important that imposition really was. So that's really, that's really the story of how there was this element. And I should also remind you that, Khomeini, one of the first acts that he did in the 1960s that made him into a political celebrity was his opposition to the White Revolution, to the series of reforms that Shah had enacted. Now, what was one of the central parts of this revolution? Female suffrage, right? Giving the right of vote to women, which Khomeini explicitly opposed. And at the time, the traditional opposition, traditional progressive opposition to the Shah, like the Communist Party of Iran, the Tudeh Party of Iran, and the National Front, the party of Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh, a left-leaning nationalist prime minister who had been overthrown by a coup led by the CIA and MI6 in 1953. They effectively gave a lukewarm support to the White Revolution. I mean, Shah was making all these reforms, and you know, it really, if you look at the reforms he made, like giving the right of vote to women, nationalization of lands, land reform, sorry, not nationalization of land reform and nationalization of some factories, giving factory shares to workers. I mean, these were left-leaning reforms. So they were naturally supported by the progressive opposition. But this is the phenomenon of the 1960s and 70s, there was a more radical wing of the opposition that opposed anything that Shah would ever do because it was only interested in getting rid of him. And of course, it's them that are able to win finally, and it's them that it's their politics that determines what kind of government we're going to have after 1979. And then that changes things, even on the women's questions, because the old style communists, the Tudeh Party and the National Front, would have much more likely to be at peace, if you will, with the kind of women's rights reforms that Shah had made, because they had a rule for gradualism, so there room for gradualism and room for these kind of reforms, whereas the more radical forces, whether socialist or Islamist, that came to rule after 1979, I didn't.
Yeah, I should mention also that Michel Foucault was enamored with the Revolution of '79, and this brings me to the question of why do you believe that Western intellectuals, and particularly French intellectuals, well, how do you explain their romance to, third world so-called liberation movements of, say, the '60s and '70s?
It's an interesting point. I think this is kind of central to some of the work that I've done. And look, in the 1960s and 70s, what we call global 60s, let's call it I call it the long 60s, which I actually argue ends in 1979 in many ways because of the disaster of the revolution and also what happens in Cambodia around the same time. You can really see the end of this period. Now, in this period, it's a period of revolutionary adventurism, really. The idea is that the 1960s is often remembered for liberation against, it's basically sort of sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And that's one aspect of the 60s. But another important aspect of it, let me even provocatively call it anti-communism, anti-communist radicalism. What do I mean by this? I mean that a lot of these radical forces, who are on the left, but some of them are also Islamist in terms of, in case of the Middle East, they really who they oppose most of this, they oppose the status quo and they oppose the sort of the rigid laws and social conventions and all that, but they're also really opposing the communist parties and the socialist parties, the old left, right? That's why we have a new left and the old left. And the old left had a understanding of society, had an understanding how change works, had an understanding of politics, mass politics. So it meant bringing together masses of people for change, which meant that basically, no, you couldn't just go and smash things up. And that no, you needed a political blueprint based on the level of development of society. Marxism has a very elaborate system of thinking about all of this. And it was just a very exciting thing if you didn't need to do any of this. And instead you had these revolutionary adventurous movements that would say, no, actually, we can smash things up. We can take power overnight, like they did in Cuba in 1959, on almost a fluke, and change everything overnight. It's, of course, a much more exciting prospect than say, oh, well, comrades, we'll come to power here in this municipality, and then we'll win the last elections, and then we'll increase the relative weight of the working class, and then, maybe for 50 years we can get to socialism. And as opposed to someone who says, no, we just need to kill who is in charge and put our friends in power and we will win. And it had actually worked in Cuba after all in 1959. I should say that Cuba is a fluke. Almost an incident that this is possible on an island nation like Cuba. It works. It's not going to work anywhere else, as Che Guevara soon finds out when he's murdered in Bolivia. And as others who try to bring this revolution anywhere else, they're not able to do it anywhere else. So in this atmosphere, for the French, who of course lived through the May 1968, they lived through all that enthusiastic movement, are unable to do anything politically in their own country. You shouldn't forget this. May 68, grand movement, lovely albums, beautiful time. We can write a lot of poems about it. But there are elections in France and they're not able to do anything. The right wing wins because they don't actually have the support of the people. And they don't have a revolutionary strategy either. They're not able to do anything. So when you're politically irrelevant in your own country, effectively, and when you lose, what better thing to do than to support the most extreme revolutionary adventures around the world? So they do this in terms of China's Cultural Revolution, of course, which has ardent support in France, as you know, um, beautifully perhaps portrayed and eternalized in Jean-Luc Godard's La Chinoise. So that's, I mean, one example, China's Cultural Revolution, which is really a brutal, um, brutal violation of most basic human decencies, assaulting people, um, putting the so-called intellectuals and urban folks in work camps around the country. It's a really, really terrible thing. And of course, they're very enthusiastically supported. In Cambodia, an extreme communist government, Maoist government, I should say, comes to power in Cambodia, went on to kill what 2/5 of the population, has a great support of the French left, especially Noam Chomsky in the United States, infamously supports it, of course. So it's not actually a surprise that Michel Foucault is interested in 1979. He's not interested. In fact, if you ask me, it's surprising why even more people weren't into it from the early on. Because look, what is better than this? The 1979 revolution, that's an argument I try to make in my work, makes perfect sense as part of the global 60s. Because if you want revolutionary adventurism, what is more adventurous than this idea that look, we're gonna get rid of this normal form of government that we've had, and we're going to have a new, as we talked about it, philosopher king. And Khomeini, had a very serious mystical side also, and we're going to have this entirely new thing. Who knows what it's going to turn out? So it's not surprising that Foucault supports it when feminists and sort of those who are worried about human rights in Iran tell him off to be worried about his support. He basically waves them off and says, "No, you don't understand. This is the greatest spiritual revolution." And it's not just surprising that he supports the revolution. It's surprising that others now, including cool Iranian lefty professors in American universities, support Foucault's line there. There's one who's written a book called "In Defense of Foucault and the Iranian Revolution," an article rather, and then a book sort of similar topic. So they are very excited about what they call the leap into the unknown. And this is my argument when I say this is what ends the 60s effectively, because I think how disastrous Cambodia turns and Chinese Cultural Revolution turns, and finally how disastrous the Islamic Revolution ends, sort of leads to a closing off of this period of revolutionary adventurism, although its malicious after effects are with us still, not just in terms of the Islamic Republic, but also because the so-called new left, although many of whom become lawyers and forget everything, not that long after, is never able to build anything. I mean, they're not able to build institutions, and their attempt to destroy the old left, only helps the status quo and the powers that be, because the old left has not been able to rebuild itself either. So I think in many ways, what is wrong with the left today, a lot of it is the legacy of that era, most poignantly symbolized by the terrible advent of the Islamic Republic.
Now, I wonder if what happened to Mahsa Amini. She was arrested under, I guess, flimsy charges of immorality and died under police custody. To what extent is that common in the Tehran regime?
Sorry, say that again. I missed you for a second.
Common.
And I do have to go in like 10 minutes, by the way.
Okay,
But
again,
yeah.
but yeah. So, how common is it that an incident like what happened to Mahsa Amini can happen?
I mean, obviously, someone getting killed is not that common. But someone being thrown into a van because the police just doesn't like what they're wearing that day, and it really could be just their, there might be a scarf that is here, maybe a scarf, maybe a, their cloak that people have to wear that is too tight. Maybe they wear leggings. Maybe their red lipstick is too red. Maybe they don't like their earrings. It could be anything. These are all real reasons for which people have been thrown into a van. That's very common. It has been less common in the last couple of years because, as I said, there was a popular resistance to it. Although, the government has still banned women and enforces mandatory hijab in a variety of ways. It gave financial penalties to people who, with these AI cameras, caught them not wearing the hijab. It closed down many cafes because they were accused of serving women without hijab. It really, it has really continued to do it. But in the last few days, really in less than a week ago, since April 13th, they started a more heavy enforcement of hijab. They passed the new hijab law, which I think it hasn't passed actually yet, but it's in the parliament, and I'm not sure what was the latest status about it. It doesn't really matter anyways, because it's not like these guys have to work according to a very particular law. But so yeah, it's very common for women to get thrown into a van and abused and sent into sort of re-education classes because of this. But once in a while, someone will also get killed, like Massa did. Yeah.
Mhm. How do you suppose the changes that occur after this nationwide nationwide protest will be?
Well, the protests failed to win for a very basic reason, which was that they didn't have political leadership. There was no political alternative leading them. And unfortunately, there has been a lot of miseducation and wrong ideas about horizontalism, about the idea that, oh, you can just change things if you have, if everybody comes to the streets. And, it's not true. You need organizations, you need political alternatives, you need political leadership. And the lack of such leadership really is what doomed the movement. The efforts to build such a leadership abroad failed ultimately for a variety of reasons. I mean, they failed very pathetically, if you ask me. They didn't get anywhere. And it's also the fact that the Iranian diaspora that had the opportunity to build organizations for many years didn't do it. Those in Iran tried to build and organize, but of course they were suppressed by the regime. So the movement failed there. And what will be the future of Iran? I mean, look, futurology is always hard for historians, but especially in case of Iran. All I can tell you is this, that I think the future of Iran will be dealt um, I think Khamenei's death, and I've written about this. I had an op-ed in the New York Times writing about that a couple of years ago in an article for the National, this newspaper in Emirates. I sort of give you some scenarios of some futurology, if you will. But I think ultimately, it's very likely that after the death of Khamenei, who is turning 85 actually in 3 days, so hopefully he's not alive much longer. After his death, I think there's a chance that there'll be fundamental shift in many policies. I think the regime might ease down some of its social policies. I think the Islamic Revolution is dead, basically. I think they're not going to necessarily continue that. And if the pillars of the revolution were the hijab and anti-Israel, anti-Western policy, I think there's a chance that they'll change. But of course, that doesn't lead to democratization. The future of Iran will be a battle between those of us who want a democracy. This is strong women's movements, trade unions, all these people that are subject of my new book. They'll continue their battles against whoever happens to be in charge. But I think after Khamenei, that whoever is much more likely to be a more familiar sort of military dictatorship type, as opposed to the current clerical caste that's in power, and their I mean, and really Khamenei's revolutionary ideals.
Now, final question before I let you go.
Mm-hmm.
You wrote a wonderful piece in Liberties on Iranian cinema. I think is a topic that we can spend another hour on because
Mm-hmm.
it's some of my favorite films are made by Iranians, Kiarostami and Panahi and all those. So I guess my question is, to what extent are the great cinematic exports of Iran reflect the Iranian people's desire for freedom, change, liberty, all those?
Thank you very much. I mean, that's basically a question that I try to sort of grapple with the essay in the Liberties. It's interesting. The essay in the Liberties began when I wanted to write about this film, Layla's Brothers. But I had, as someone who had read Liberties from the first issue, and I really loved its tone, and I decided to do something more substantial than writing what was effectively a film review. And instead, I tried to sort of tell a story of what filmmaking in Iran is, how is it that perhaps answer this conundrum? Why is it that Iran has one of this, um, one of the most repressive regimes in the world and one of the best cinemas in the world? So my answer to your question is that it's not so much that, oh, the filmmakers in Iran want to represent the movements for democracy or freedom or sure, a lot of them have done so explicitly, and in my book, I talk about Tarna Ali Dosti, this actress who goes into jail, and tons of others who have done that. And um, but I think more importantly, and that's what I try to say in the Liberties piece, which I really encourage people if they have time or interest to read, and I would love to know what they think. What I've tried to say is that it's not what they do, it's what they are. So what Iranian cinema represents is not so much, oh, people are struggling for democracy, here's a film about it. It's that by their very act of art and filmmaking, they've represented a different Iran. They've lived a different life. They embodied a different life other than the, austere, xenophobic, regressive regime that rules over them. They are, they are, as I said, they represent a different Iran. Not just the Iran of a struggle, but Iran of art, of beauty, um, of humanity, right? So that's why films of Kiarostami are not political. They don't need to be political directly, right? They're not about trade unions or political struggles or political movements, but they represent a different. They are a fresh um, feeling of humanity, if you will, um, in a regime that told you everything needs to be, and not that just the regime. In fact, you could say the regime and its opposition before, um, you know, uh, in the 1980s, and Kiarostami comes of age as a filmmaker. They made everything about ideology. Everything had to fit into a certain framework, and some Kiarostami says, "No, I can make a beautiful film about kids in a village in northern Iran." And all human questions can be answered there. And this is my take on reality. I don't need to be after a political idea or ideology. I think yes, that's the relationship, if you will, of the Iranian cinema and the repression and the repressive government that rules over us.
I think that's a wonderful note to end on. Thank you very much, Arash
All
Azizi.
right. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.